Everything was calm until one comment changed the entire conversation. What happens when a routine conversation on live television takes an unexpected turn? Make sure to subscribe to Table Turn and like and comment for more real talk show coverage. On a weekday morning episode of The View, what began as a standard promotional interview with Leonardo DiCaprio gradually shifted into something far more tense than most viewers expected. The segment was originally positioned as a discussion about his latest film project and his long-standing environmental advocacy. The tone at the start was calm, professional, and in line with what audiences have come to expect from daytime talk television. The studio lighting was bright, the hosts were seated around the table, and the audience had just finished applauding his introduction. Leonardo DiCaprio walked out to warm applause, greeting the panel with polite smiles and handshakes. Joy Behar, seated near the center of the table, offered a brief welcome, acknowledging his decades-long career and recent film release. Whoopi Goldberg gave a quick nod of appreciation, while Sunny Hostin and Sarah Haynes leaned in attentively. The mood felt relaxed. The first several minutes followed a predictable rhythm. Leonardo spoke about preparing for his role, the collaboration with the director, and the challenges of portraying complex characters. He answered thoughtfully, keeping his tone measured. The hosts responded with follow-up questions that allowed him to elaborate without interruption. There were a few light jokes exchanged, mostly about how long he has been in the public eye and how audiences have watched him grow from a young actor into an established Hollywood figure. The discussion then transitioned into environmental issues, a topic closely associated with him for years. Joy Behar referenced his speeches at international climate conferences and his foundation's efforts to support conservation projects. Leonardo responded by emphasizing the urgency of climate change and the importance of bipartisan cooperation. He spoke in a composed and deliberate way, clearly used to discussing the subject in public forums. At this stage, nothing felt unusual. The audience responded with supportive applause when he mentioned renewable energy initiatives. The conversation appeared to be moving in a constructive direction. However, the shift began subtly when Joy Behar introduced a question about celebrity activism more broadly. She framed it by acknowledging that public figures have platforms that reach millions of people, but she also raised concerns some critics have voiced about consistency. She asked, in a conversational tone, how celebrities balance advocating for environmental change while maintaining lifestyles that may include private jets or international travel. The question itself was not confrontational on the surface. It was delivered with a slight smile, and Joy's voice remained even. But the framing introduced a level of scrutiny that changed the energy at the table. Leonardo paused for a moment before answering. Viewers watching live may have noticed the slight shift in his posture. He leaned back slightly, then forward again, as if choosing his words carefully. He responded by explaining that while he does travel frequently for work and advocacy, he also invests in carbon offset programs and supports sustainable technology. He emphasized that systemic change requires policy reform and corporate accountability, not just individual lifestyle adjustments. His tone remained calm, but it was firmer than before. Joy followed up by saying that some viewers feel frustrated when celebrities appear to lecture everyday people about reducing their carbon footprint while flying privately. She clarified that she wasn't attacking him personally, but reflecting on broader public sentiment. Her delivery was direct, characteristic of her style on the show. Leonardo's expression tightened slightly. He acknowledged the criticism but pointed out that focusing solely on individual behavior distracts from larger environmental policy failures. He said that public figures often use the resources available to them to amplify causes and fund solutions. There was no raised voice, but the back-and-forth rhythm became quicker. Sunny Hostin briefly interjected, suggesting that public figures can both advocate for systemic change and model personal responsibility. Her comment seemed intended to balance the exchange. Whoopi Goldberg nodded and added that conversations about climate responsibility are complicated and often emotional. Joy, however, returned to the original concern, pressing gently but persistently. She asked whether high-profile activists risk alienating working-class viewers who feel judged. This time, Leonardo responded with visible seriousness. He said he never intends to judge individuals and that the climate crisis affects everyone, especially vulnerable communities. The audience grew quieter. The laughter that had punctuated the earlier part of the segment was gone. Instead, viewers in the studio listened closely. The camera cut briefly to a wide shot of the table, capturing the body language. Joy leaning slightly forward with her hands folded, Leonardo sitting upright, hands gesturing in controlled movements. There was a moment when both began speaking at once. Joy attempted to clarify her point while Leonardo tried to finish his sentence about environmental equity. It was not shouting, but it was the first clear interruption of the segment. Whoopi raised her hand slightly, a subtle moderator's signal, and calmly said, "Let's let him finish." Leonardo completed his thought, stating that he welcomes scrutiny and believes open dialogue is necessary. His tone suggested he felt misunderstood, though he kept his words measured. Joy nodded but responded by saying that public conversations require transparency. The exchange was still within the bounds of typical daytime debate, but viewers could sense a shift. The initial promotional tone had given way to a more pointed discussion. The tension did not stem from personal insults or dramatic accusations. Instead, it came from two experienced communicators standing firm in their perspectives. As the segment continued, Sarah Haynes attempted to lighten the mood by pivoting back to the film. She asked how working on creative projects helps balance the weight of advocacy work. Leonardo seemed grateful for the change in topic and answered with a small smile, describing filmmaking as a collaborative escape. But Joy returned once more to the earlier theme, asking whether he believes Hollywood itself does enough to address environmental sustainability in production. This question broadened the discussion again, and Leonardo acknowledged that the industry has more work to do. At this point, the exchange felt less like a friendly interview and more like a live policy discussion. The audience remained attentive. Applause was sporadic and cautious. The panel's body language reflected concentration rather than entertainment. What made the moment stand out was not volume or hostility. It was the visible difference in emphasis. Joy appeared focused on accountability and public perception. Leonardo emphasized structural change and collective responsibility. Neither backed down, and neither fully conceded the other's framing. As the conversation continued, the atmosphere at the table remained controlled, but the tone was noticeably more serious than it had been at the beginning of the segment. What had started as a promotional interview had clearly moved into deeper territory, and the panel seemed aware that viewers were paying close attention to how the exchange was unfolding. Leonardo DiCaprio maintained a steady posture, his hands occasionally folding together on the table as he listened. Joy Behar, still leaning slightly forward, kept her gaze fixed on him as she clarified her earlier point. She explained that her question wasn't meant to undermine environmental advocacy, but to reflect concerns that often come up in public discourse. She mentioned that some people feel disconnected from celebrity-led movements because they perceive a gap between message and lifestyle. Leonardo responded by acknowledging that perception matters. He said that it's important for advocates to be mindful of how their actions are interpreted. However, he reiterated that climate change is a systemic issue requiring government action, corporate reform, and global cooperation. He carefully emphasized that focusing solely on personal consumption habits risks oversimplifying a complex global problem. Sunny Hostin then stepped in, asking whether Leonardo believed public pressure on high-profile individuals can still play a productive role. Her tone was analytical rather than confrontational. Leonardo agreed that accountability is part of public life and that scrutiny can push industries to evolve. He noted that film productions have increasingly adopted sustainable practices, including reducing on-set waste and investing in renewable energy sources. Joy listened, nodding slightly, but she returned to a key concern. She asked whether the messaging sometimes unintentionally creates resentment among viewers who may already be struggling financially. Her point centered on relatability. She said that when everyday people hear about carbon offsets and international conferences, they might feel the conversation is happening at a level far removed from their daily realities. This time, Leonardo's response carried a hint of visible frustration, though his voice remained even. He explained that the climate crisis disproportionately affects lower-income communities and that advocacy is often aimed at protecting those very groups. He clarified that the intention is not to lecture individuals, but to push institutions toward long-term solutions. There was a brief pause after he finished speaking. The studio audience remained quiet, absorbing the exchange. The earlier light laughter had completely faded. Even the usual subtle background movement seemed reduced, as if everyone in the room sensed the importance of the moment. Whoopi Goldberg stepped in again, her voice calm and steady. She said that these kinds of discussions are valuable precisely because they highlight differing perspectives. She gently reminded the panel that live television allows for real-time dialogue, and not every disagreement needs to feel like a conflict. That intervention seemed to soften the edges slightly. Leonardo nodded in agreement. Joy offered a brief smile, acknowledging that the conversation was meant to explore nuance rather than assign blame. However, the tension had not entirely dissipated. Joy introduced a specific example, referencing past criticism directed at environmental activists who use private air travel. She framed it broadly but clearly connected it to the broader debate surrounding celebrity advocacy. She asked Leonardo whether he believes symbolic gestures matter in shaping public trust. Leonardo took a moment before answering. Viewers watching closely may have noticed him inhaling slowly before speaking. He said that symbolism can matter, but so does scale. He pointed out that the aviation industry as a whole contributes a measurable percentage of global emissions and that technological innovation within the industry is essential. He emphasized that personal choices must be evaluated within a larger systemic context. The exchange became more layered. Joy countered by suggesting that while systemic reform is critical, public figures often influence cultural norms. She argued that modeling restraint can send a powerful message. Her tone was not accusatory, but it was firm. Leonardo responded by saying that he agrees with encouraging responsible behavior, but cautioned against framing environmental progress as a matter of individual purity. He said that real change requires collaboration between governments, corporations, and citizens. Sarah Haynes, sensing the intensity, asked whether social media has amplified scrutiny in ways that make advocacy more complicated. Leonardo agreed that digital platforms can sometimes reduce complex conversations to brief headlines, which may not capture the full context of someone's efforts. The studio audience offered a small round of applause at that point, perhaps signaling agreement with the idea that online discussions often lack nuance. The applause was polite rather than enthusiastic, but it marked the first audible reaction in several minutes. Joy then made a comment that subtly shifted the tone again. She said that part of her role in the show is to ask the questions viewers at home might be thinking. She emphasized that transparency strengthens credibility. While she maintained a conversational delivery, the comment reinforced her position as a challenger in the discussion. Leonardo acknowledged that perspective and said he respects tough questions. However, he added that sometimes the focus on personal lifestyle can overshadow policy advocacy and scientific urgency. His phrasing was precise, but there was a clear undercurrent of defensiveness. At one point, both began speaking simultaneously again, though neither raised their voice. Whoopi intervened quickly, lightly tapping the table and saying, "One at a time." The reminder was delivered with a half smile, but it served as a clear signal to slow the pace. The conversation shifted briefly toward solutions. Sonny asked Leonardo what gives him hope despite ongoing criticism. He spoke about young activists, technological innovation, and bipartisan initiatives at local levels. His voice softened slightly as he described meeting students who are passionate about environmental science. That moment seemed to ease the tension. The audience responded with warmer applause. Joy nodded, acknowledging the importance of youth engagement. Still, the earlier disagreement lingered beneath the surface. Joy offered a final clarification on her position during this portion of the segment. She said that questioning public figures does not negate support for the cause itself. Her emphasis was on accountability as part of democratic discourse. Leonardo responded by agreeing that accountability is necessary, but added that it should be applied consistently across industries and political leaders. He pointed out that entertainers often face scrutiny, while major corporate emitters receive less direct attention in mainstream conversations. This comment drew a noticeable reaction from the audience, some murmurs, followed by scattered applause. By the time the discussion moved further into the segment, The energy in the studio had shifted from polite debate to something more deliberate and carefully measured. No one at the table appeared visibly upset, but the earlier lightness was gone. What viewers were watching now was a real-time negotiation of perspective, the kind that unfolds when both sides feel strongly about how an issue should be framed. Leonardo DiCaprio sat upright, shoulders squared, his hands resting closer together on the table than before. Joy Behar maintained her forward-leaning posture, signaling engagement. The exchange had not escalated in volume, but the rhythm of the conversation had changed. There were fewer pauses for humor and more moments where each sentence felt considered. Sunny Hostin attempted to broaden the discussion by bringing up policy. She asked Leonardo whether he believed current federal environmental initiatives were moving fast enough. This pivot introduced a slightly different angle, giving Leonardo space to talk about legislative progress rather than personal accountability. Leonardo responded by referencing recent climate investments and infrastructure developments. He spoke carefully, avoiding partisan language while emphasizing urgency. He acknowledged that progress has been made but stressed that scientific reports indicate more aggressive timelines are necessary. His tone was steady and analytical. Joy listened, then interjected with a subtle shift in focus. She suggested that while federal action is critical, public trust in messaging often determines whether policies gain widespread support. She noted that skepticism can grow when people feel there's a disconnect between public figures and everyday realities. It was clear she was circling back to the earlier theme, but this time in a more indirect way. Leonardo responded that he understands the importance of relatability. He said that advocacy is most effective when it connects to lived experience. He pointed out that rising energy costs, extreme weather events, and food supply disruptions already affect working families. His argument was that climate change is not an abstract future threat, but a present-day concern. At this point, the audience offered a small round of applause. It wasn't loud, but it signaled agreement with the idea that climate issues are immediate. The hosts briefly glanced toward the audience before returning to the table. Joy then asked a more pointed question. She wondered whether celebrity-driven campaigns sometimes unintentionally simplify complex scientific debates into slogans. Her tone was thoughtful rather than accusatory, but the question carried weight. She framed it as a concern about messaging strategy rather than personal conduct. Leonardo paused before answering. The camera caught a brief moment where he pressed his lips together, appearing to gather his thoughts. He responded by saying that communication must balance clarity with accuracy. He acknowledged that slogans can oversimplify, but argued that public awareness often begins with accessible messaging. From there, he said, deeper conversations can follow. The pace of the exchange slowed again. Whoopi Goldberg leaned slightly forward, her hands folded, listening carefully. Sarah Haynes watched Leonardo as he spoke, occasionally nodding. Joy followed up by asking whether he believes criticism of celebrity activism is sometimes valid. She emphasized that public figures occupy influential positions and that questioning them does not necessarily undermine their causes. It was a subtle but important reframing. She was positioning her earlier questions as part of a larger democratic dialogue. Leonardo answered directly. He said that criticism is part of public life and that he does not expect immunity from it. However, he added that the tone of criticism can shape whether conversations remain productive. He suggested that when discussions focus primarily on personal lifestyle rather than policy impact, the broader objective can get lost. There was a brief moment when both began speaking again, though this time they stopped themselves almost immediately. Joy gestured lightly with her hand, indicating she would let him finish. That small act of deference slightly eased the tension at the table. Sunny then introduced a perspective about generational shifts. She asked whether younger audiences approach environmental accountability differently than older generations. Leonardo agreed that younger people often prioritize sustainability in purchasing decisions and political engagement. He described meeting student activists who are highly informed and organized. Joy acknowledged that point but added that generational differences can also create friction. She mentioned that older viewers sometimes feel dismissed in cultural conversations about change. Her comment wasn't directed at Leonardo personally, but it carried an implicit caution about tone and inclusivity. Leonardo responded by saying that effective advocacy must avoid alienating any group. He emphasized collaboration across age, class, and political lines. His voice remained controlled, though his cadence had become slightly quicker, suggesting engagement rather than irritation. At one point, Whoopi gently reminded the panel of the time remaining in the segment. The reminder brought a subtle awareness that the conversation needed to move toward resolution. However, instead of pivoting away, Joy posed one final direct question on the topic. She asked whether Leonardo believes celebrities should publicly disclose the full environmental impact of their travel as a form of transparency. The question was specific, and it prompted another noticeable pause. Leonardo answered that transparency can be constructive, but must be implemented broadly to be meaningful. He said that if disclosure becomes selective or symbolic, it risks turning into a distraction rather than a solution. The audience reacted with a mix of silence and light applause. It was clear that viewers were absorbing the nuance rather than reacting emotionally. No one at the table appeared angry, but the sustained intensity was unmistakable. From a body language perspective, the exchange showed signs of fatigue. Leonardo leaned back slightly after finishing his response, as if signaling he had said what he needed to say. Joy also leaned back, folding her hands, her expression neutral but thoughtful. Sarah attempted once more to redirect toward the film, asking about the collaborative process with the cast. Leonardo welcomed the shift, speaking about creative teamwork and storytelling. His tone softened, and a few smiles returned to the table. Still, the earlier tension lingered beneath the surface. The conversation about environmental accountability had not been fully resolved, nor was it likely to be in a short television segment. But what stood out was the professionalism maintained throughout. There were interruptions, yes, and moments where voices overlapped. Yet there was no shouting, no personal attacks, only firm positions expressed in real time. As the segment moved into its final stretch before the commercial break, there was a noticeable effort from everyone at the table to steady the tone. The conversation had not spiraled out of control, but it had undeniably grown more pointed than the typical daytime interview. Viewers watching live could sense that both Leonardo DiCaprio and Joy Behar were aware of how the exchange might be perceived beyond the studio walls. Whoopi Goldberg took a slightly more active moderating role at this point. She calmly summarized the discussion so far, noting that the conversation had touched on activism, accountability, public perception, and systemic reform. Her voice was even and deliberate, as if recentering the panel. She thanked Leonardo for being willing to engage with difficult questions and acknowledged Joy's role in raising concerns viewers may share. Leonardo nodded in agreement, offering a brief smile. The tension in his posture appeared to ease slightly. His shoulders relaxed as he responded to Whoopi's summary by saying that open dialogue is essential. He added that he never expects a platform to be free of challenging questions and that public discourse improves when multiple viewpoints are expressed. Joy responded by clarifying once again that her questions were rooted in a belief that credibility strengthens movements. She said that when public figures explain their decisions transparently, it reinforces trust. Her tone was measured and steady. The earlier firmness was still present, but it no longer felt sharp. Instead, it came across as reflective. Sunny Hostin then asked Leonardo whether he has ever reconsidered aspects of his own lifestyle in response to public feedback. This question seemed to bridge the earlier disagreement rather than deepen it. Leonardo acknowledged that public conversations have influenced how he approaches certain decisions. He mentioned supporting emerging sustainable aviation technologies and investing in renewable infrastructure projects. He framed these efforts not as defensive reactions, but as part of a broader commitment to solutions. The audience responded with light applause. It wasn't exuberant, but it suggested appreciation for a constructive answer. The atmosphere in the studio felt calmer than it had just minutes earlier. Joy listened carefully and then made a comment that subtly shifted the dynamic again, though not in a confrontational way. She said that perhaps part of the disconnect in these discussions comes from how media clips circulate online. She pointed out that short segments can make disagreements appear sharper than they feel in real time. That observation seemed to acknowledge the very nature of live television and viral moments. Leonardo agreed, saying that context often gets lost in condensed social media clips. He noted that full conversations rarely fit into brief online excerpts. His tone suggested an awareness that this exchange itself might soon be shared widely. At this point, Sarah Haynes brought the discussion back to the film project that had prompted his appearance. She asked how storytelling can influence public understanding of complex issues. Leonardo answered thoughtfully, explaining that film has the power to humanize large-scale problems by focusing on individual experiences. He described how narratives can connect audiences emotionally to topics they might otherwise view as abstract. This portion of the discussion felt noticeably lighter. The table's body language shifted accordingly. Joy leaned back comfortably in her chair. Whoopi offered a small smile. The tension that had defined the earlier exchange seemed to soften into something closer to mutual acknowledgement. However, just as the conversation appeared to be settling, Joy offered one more observation. She said that while she supports environmental advocacy, she believes public figures must accept that scrutiny is part of leadership. Her tone was calm, almost conversational, but it reiterated her central point. Leonardo responded without hesitation this time. He said that he does accept scrutiny and believes accountability strengthens causes when it is applied consistently and fairly. He added that he hopes discussions remain focused on collective progress rather than personal contradictions. His delivery was direct but no longer edged with defensiveness. There was a brief pause after that exchange. The studio audience remained quiet for a moment before offering another round of polite applause. It felt less like taking sides and more like acknowledging the conclusion of a substantive discussion. Whoopi glanced toward the producers off camera, likely receiving cues about timing. She thanked Leonardo for joining the show and emphasized that meaningful conversations sometimes involve disagreement. She reiterated that the panel values dialogue that challenges and informs. Leonardo thanked the hosts in return, expressing appreciation for the opportunity to discuss both his film and environmental advocacy. He maintained eye contact with Joy as he spoke, and she nodded in response. There was no visible tension in that closing exchange, only professionalism. As the show prepared to cut to commercial, the camera widened to capture the full table. The audience applauded more fully now, signaling a sense of closure. Leonardo stood, shaking hands with the hosts one by one. Joy offered a brief smile and a few quiet words that were not audible to viewers, but appeared cordial. From a viewer's perspective, Part 4 highlighted how live television manages moments of tension. The disagreement had never crossed into hostility, but it had been firm enough to feel authentic. Both participants maintained composure throughout, even when the discussion became pointed. What made the exchange stand out was not raised voices or dramatic gestures. It was the sustained difference in emphasis. Joy consistently focused on perception and accountability. Leonardo consistently emphasized systemic reform and policy change. Neither position invalidated the other, yet they approached the issue from distinct angles. As the segment ended and the program transitioned to commercial break, viewers at home were left with a sense that they had witnessed a genuine conversation rather than a scripted promotional appearance. The tension had been real but controlled, and the professionalism on display reflected the norms of daytime talk television. Still, as the show moved on to its next segment, it was clear that the earlier exchange would not simply fade into the background. In the age of social media, moments like these often take on a life beyond the studio. And as the credits for the episode would later roll, the discussion between Leonardo DiCaprio and Joy Behar was already beginning to generate reactions far beyond the walls of the set. By the time the show returned from commercial break, the tone in the studio had fully reset. The next segment moved on to a lighter topic, and the earlier discussion was not revisited on air. For viewers watching casually, it might have seemed as though the moment had passed. But for those who had followed the exchange closely, there was a clear understanding that something more substantial had unfolded than a routine celebrity interview. Leonardo DiCaprio did not reappear after the break, as his segment had concluded. The panel transitioned smoothly into the next topic, maintaining the professional rhythm that daytime television relies on. Yet, even as the hosts discussed unrelated matters, there was a subtle shift in the audience's energy. The applause was slightly more restrained at first, as if people were still processing what they had witnessed. When the episode eventually wrapped, the audience offered the standard closing applause. There was no visible tension lingering on set. The hosts smiled, waved, and thanked viewers for watching. From a production standpoint, the show had handled the disagreement in a measured way. No emergency pivots, no abrupt cutaways, just a live conversation that ran its course. However, outside the studio, the reaction began almost immediately. Clips of the exchange started circulating online within hours. Short segments highlighting the most pointed moments between Joy Behar and Leonardo DiCaprio appeared across social media platforms. Some clips focused on Joy's question about celebrity lifestyle and environmental messaging. Others emphasized Leonardo's defense of systemic reform and policy responsibility. What stood out in the online reaction was how differently viewers interpreted the same exchange. Some praised Joy for asking direct questions they felt needed to be addressed. They described her approach as consistent with her role on the panel, raising concerns that everyday viewers might have about public figures. Others defended Leonardo, arguing that he remained composed and articulated a thoughtful response under scrutiny. Importantly, the majority of commentary acknowledged that the discussion never devolved into personal hostility. Even critics on either side noted that both participants maintained professionalism. The phrase "heated argument" began trending in some online discussions, but when viewers revisited the full segment, many remarked that the tone was serious rather than explosive. Media outlets that cover television and celebrity appearances picked up the story by the following day. Headlines framed the moment as a tense exchange on live television, but detailed recaps often pointed out the nuance. Writers described how the disagreement centered on messaging strategy and public accountability rather than personal conflict. In interviews conducted after the episode aired, sources close to the show indicated that no backstage confrontation occurred. There were no reports of raised voices off camera. The disagreement remained contained within the bounds of the live discussion itself. That detail reinforced the sense that what viewers saw was an authentic debate rather than a manufactured spectacle. Joy Behar addressed the exchange briefly on a later episode, clarifying that her intention was to explore public perception, not to undermine environmental advocacy. She reiterated that open dialogue is part of the show's format. Her comments were calm and measured, consistent with how she had handled the conversation live. Leonardo DiCaprio did not release any formal statement about the appearance, but in a subsequent public event, he continued speaking about environmental policy in much the same way he had on the show. Observers noted that his messaging remained consistent, suggesting that the exchange had not altered his advocacy approach. Viewer reactions continued to circulate for several days. Some audience members who attended the taping shared that the tension felt noticeable but controlled in person. They described the atmosphere as serious but respectful. One attendee commented online that it felt like watching two experienced communicators defend their perspectives without losing composure. From a broader perspective, the segment became an example of how live television can capture genuine disagreement without crossing into spectacle. In an era when viral moments often involve shouting or abrupt walk-offs, this exchange stood out precisely because it did not escalate that way. The tension built gradually, remained focused on substance, and concluded with mutual professionalism. What made the moment resonate with viewers was its realism. It reflected the kind of conversations happening across the country, discussions about climate change, accountability, and the role of public figures in shaping discourse. The disagreement was not about personalities, it was about framing and emphasis. By the end of the week, the story had largely settled into the broader cycle of talk show highlights. Yet for many viewers, it remained memorable because it demonstrated how daytime television can host meaningful debate within a structured format. The segment ended not with confrontation, but with applause and acknowledgement. The studio audience reacted in real time, offering polite but engaged responses throughout. Online audiences extended the conversation, debating who made the stronger points and whether the exchange reflected larger cultural divides. Ultimately, the moment underscored the nature of live discussion. There are no retakes, no edits to soften sharp edges. What unfolds happens in real time, shaped by tone, pacing, and reaction. In this case, What began as a promotional appearance evolved into a thoughtful, occasionally tense, but entirely professional debate about environmental responsibility and public accountability. And that is what made it go viral. Not shouting, not spectacle, but substance. Now we want to hear from you. Did Joy's questions reflect necessary accountability? Or did Leonardo make the stronger case about systemic change? Share your opinion in the comments and subscribe to Table Turn for more narration-based talk show stories.